So, good afternoon, everybody. I think we are the only things that stand between wine and cheese. Which means the other speaker had, lunch for you to digest, and we're between wine and cheese. We will not disappoint. You'll get to wine and cheese on time. We have the pleasure of speaking about the wisdom of Henri Nouwen and the wounded healer. So without further ado, we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves in terms of how we came to know Henri. So I won't go over the bios for the wonderful people that are sharing the stage with me, with Michelle and Jim. But let me jump into what our proposal is. We're each going to share for about 10 minutes. And as a learning opportunity, what we'd like to ask you to think about, and I will ask you to put your hand up in a second, reading that question, has integrated a personal wound ever helped you preach or pastorally act better in your ministry to others? Now remember this, we've got a few hands. Any other brave people want to admit that they've worked through a wound? The good thing about a conference like this is if you've avoided wounds your whole life, you would never come to one of these, right? Okay. Alrighty, so we hope we'll help you think a little bit about that, and this is what we're going to do. I'm going to situate Henri Nouwen in his historical context. Michelle's going to talk a little bit about key themes from his writing, and Jim's going to talk about what it means to preach as a wounded healer. And then we're going to open up for Q&A, and wonderful Lisa's going to walk around with a mic to ask any questions you'd like to ask of us. So for what I'd like to do with you is I'd like to think a little bit about one key insight from my study of Henri Nouwen that I think you really ought to know. It helps you understand why this conference is set up this way. Secondly, I just want to situate him with some facts. Where does he come from? What was he trying to do? When did he write this really important book called The Wounded Healer? And then thirdly, begin to introduce themes that Michelle's going to talk more about. So the wound called loneliness and the wounded healer for ministry. So at 100,000 feet, in 1999, there was a breakthrough biography that came out about Henri Nouwen. He had already been deceased. And it was written by Michael Ford. And we can talk more about why that biography was particularly controversial in the time. It had to do with understanding Henri Nouwen's own sexuality and his own approach to relationships. But this line is seminal. The wounds that Henri often spoke about were those of alienation, separation, isolation, and loneliness. And the author writes, wounds that he shared himself. And then fast forward a few years, there's a wonderful CBC series that you can easily Google called Genius Born of Anguish. I'd recommend you listen to it if you like what we're talking about today. It won a number of awards, actually, a New York Award for Best Documentary on the Radio. Written by Michael Higgins, Kevin Burns. Full disclosure, I get to share the stage with a few really famous people. But my area of expertise was thinking about Henri Nouwen's study of a guy named Anton Boysen. We'll talk about him in a second. But this quote from Jean Vanier is the title of the book. Henri Nouwen is a genius born of anguish. And what Vanier meant by that is that he began to understand that if, back to our learning question, if you work through your wounds, they can also begin to shed light and hope in your ministry, in your life, and in your relationship with God. But it comes from doing that work. So a question that Jim will address a little later is, what does that mean for preaching, being a wounded healer? So some really high-level facts. If you know nothing about Henri Nouwen, you need to know that he wasn't born in North America, born in 1932 in Holland, but spent most of his life in North America for ministry. He was remarkably interested in something called clinical pastoral education, which is a formation excellence that Jim has and that I have. That means that we're pastoral counselors, work in healthcare at the bedside with people that are struggling around questions of meaning. He went to Topeka, Kansas, where he actually met the founder of the CPE movement, Anton Boysen, and then from there tried to write a dissertation about Anton Boysen several times, failed at it, but then I wrote my dissertation on Nouwen writing his dissertation, so it's a nice way to get a PhD. He then, while he failed to get the credentials he was looking for, he was a remarkably gifted speaker. He would pack theology rooms at these big schools Notre Dame, Yale, and Harvard. And he wrote over 40 books that are still being published and republished. Actually, books are being published now that he's dead from his archives. So he's a man, one person said, never had an unpublished thought in his life. So why is this important? He dies in 1996 after several years with L'Arche Daybreak, a place where people's external wounds are remarkably obvious. We heard about that in the speaker after today. But what L'Arche taught him too is that there are internal wounds that we hide remarkably well, and working through those is an important part of his contribution at the integration of psychology and spirituality. The book that this conference gets its title from, The Wounded Healer, was written in 1972. This is the early 4 books of his 40-plus book publishing. He was writing at this time around ministry. What does ministry mean in a disjointed or disgruntled time when people just aren't sure who they are, and people, like Henri Nouwen, are really, really struggling with loneliness? So he writes his first article on Anton Boysen, an idea that living human documents can do theology. This is a really important part if you're working as a minister and as a preacher, that a life has a human story, but also a human divine story. And look at the 4 books there. He first writes about intimacy. Again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. And then he writes about creative ministry, wounded healing, and a living reminder. Really, really important seminal works. I'll suggest that his best book is not The Wounded Healer, but I think The Living Reminder is actually a really great book if you want to understand ministry, and Michelle's going to talk about that as well. So here's that wonderful book, The Wounded Healer. We each brought our copies because we pulled them off of our bookshelves as we were preparing for this. And this came out in 1972. And it's 1 chapter in 4 where he's talking about the loneliness of the minister. So remember where I started. He was dealing with this himself. Remarkably successful, preached at all the greatest churches in North America and beyond. Thousands of people listened to him. But he would often get so much adulation when people heard him speak that he'd go to his hotel room and he'd cry because he thought nobody loved him. So you got to wonder what's going on. But back then, he started thinking about this in terms of loneliness, and he used, which was another genius part of his writing style, he used a Jewish tractate that asked the question, who is the Messiah? How would I recognize the Messiah that's going to come and help me out of my loneliness? We don't have time to read it today because we've got a short time, but the key line in it is up here. The Messiah is the following person. You'll see a bunch of people who think they're messiahs by the gate, this Jewish tractate says. But the one who is the Messiah is the one who has many wounds, but only one is unbounded. And the reason one is unbounded is that if he unbounded all of them, or she unbounded all of them, she wouldn't have time to stand up and go and help the person in need. Interesting idea, right? So you can be wounded and helping people. And what I love about this is that it actually, if you follow the logic in the text, it reminds you that it's not a simple dichotomy between being healthy or wounded. It's about being both. The healer is not perfect. The wounded person is not necessarily so wounded that she cannot help another person. And the idea that wounds can somehow be a source of beauty. Again, if you work in the ministry that I do at Unity Health, where we see a lot of folks that are really, really struggling, how can you help to find some meaning in the midst of a life of suffering that often comes through our doors? I would have hired Henri Nouwen if he was working as a chaplain and wanted to work for us. Let me end with this last slide. I told you about a thesis direction that he was going in about Anton Boysen. This fellow had serious mental health issues, but he also created the gift of clinical pastoral education. So Nouwen was writing about him. And in an interview with him from 1965, he looked at Anton Boysen and used language very similar from the one that we actually find in this text. That a person, or in this case the image of a Grand Canyon, can look so ragged, so deep, so incisive, that it can also not just lead you to despair, but lead you to get a glimpse of something that is beautiful and something that leads to self-understanding. And with that, I'd like to pass over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Chris. And good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I didn't know Henri personally, but I began studying theology before he died in the mid-90s. And he died in 1996. But I always knew of his work. And my background is nursing, as well as some lay ministry work. So in 2007, I needed to do some thesis work for my master's, and I wanted to do something in the area of spirituality and palliative care. And I read Henri's book called Our Greatest Gift, which was a reflection of his own mortality after he had almost died, and he was reflecting on dying well and caring well and grieving well, and he said some things in here that were really amazing, and I thought I really wanted to look further into his life. So I started 6 months of research. I live in Chatham, but I came up and I stayed at Daybreak, and I got to meet his friends and interview people that he lived with and research articles and videos down at the Henri Nouwen Archives at the University of Toronto. And I read all his 40 books, most of them on the night shift in Emerge, because I was, you know, when you work in ministry, you also have to have a part-time job that pays the bills. So I always kept my nursing job. Anyways, all this really led me to be affected by Henri's writings and his life, both personally and professionally. So although I never met him, I really felt his spirit in my work, and I continue to do that. I was really blessed that my thesis was published by Orbis Books, and that kind of started me in a whole different realm than I had ever planned on being in, of writing. But for me, the fact that Henri had a background in theology, psychology, and spirituality is what was most appealing to me. He had this way to bridge the sacred and the secular. And I worked in secular healthcare. But I really, you know, he had these notions of compassion and dignity and all of these universal themes that, you know, could really speak to the things that I could learn from. He also knew that the head and the heart were connected. And that led him, of course, to study CPE, as Chris explained. So he really understood how he needed to be present, not only to his own wounds and his own need for healing, but also to the woundedness of others. So his ability to be in solidarity with those who were questioning and suffering, because he was so in touch with his own questions and his own suffering, that was part of, I think, the genius and the accessibility of his work. The people in the pew loved to read his books. It wasn't all theological language, because he just talked about that stuff of life. So when you think about woundedness, you know, when we look back on the last few years, I think that so much of our own woundedness and suffering can be traced to our experiences in the pandemic and the fallout from that, which we're still experiencing. So this is coupled with a really record number of people in ministry, healthcare, social work, who are experiencing the effects of burnout and compassion fatigue and moral distress and depression. Our mental health and the mental health of the people that we serve and live with has been deeply and deeply affected. And it must be acknowledged and spoken about in order for us to begin to move to healing. So as Chris said, this work, The Wounded Healer, comes from 1972, 50 years ago. And yet his wisdom is timeless, because he poses this question in the introduction: what does it mean to be a minister in our contemporary society? Well, that's a question we could ask ourselves today. But he goes on to say that the minister's service will not be perceived as authentic unless it comes from a heart wounded by the suffering about which they speak. So I think the first point that I want to make is that I believe that people are most effective in their preaching and their ministry if they are authentic. It's not just words that change hearts. It's that life lived with honesty and integrity, along with the work of the Spirit, of course. But Henri said in the conclusion of The Wounded Healer that The imitation of Christ does not mean to live a life like Christ, but to live your life as authentically as Christ lived his. So a lot of the work that I do today now is workshops and things helping caring professionals like yourselves and people in healthcare primarily learn how to take care of themselves. And often, in these helping professions, I dare say we neglect our own needs in the process. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think that staying healthy when you care for others includes building capacity and resilience so that you're healthy enough yourself to do this work. You can't give what you don't have. And when we talk about resilience, that includes a focus on taking care of ourselves, self-care, a focus on relieving chronic stress, and a key factor, which really comes back to the work in this book, is increasing our self-awareness. And we could spend a whole day talking about this, but I'm reading from notes because I'm trying to do it in 10 minutes. But how often do we reflect really on how we're doing and the need we have to take care of ourselves, body, mind, and spirit? Everybody's different. Nobody can tell you what you need. Only you can do that with some good self-reflection. So being more self-aware includes taking to heart, what do we schedule in our busy lives to keep ourselves healthy despite our workload? We all need rest. We all need time to retreat. We all need time to refresh and nourish ourselves. And we all need time to spend alone with the Lord, building that relationship. And sometimes we spend a lot of time feeling guilty about the fact that we are or we aren't doing that well. But the role model for this kind of ministry was Jesus himself. I mean, who do you know that took 40 days off before they started a new job? And he didn't feel guilty and he didn't apologize. And throughout the Gospels, Jesus understood the need to disengage from the crowds and to re-engage with the Father, to spend time with his community of disciples, to spend time in his own heart. And he would often go into the desert or into the garden or go back to the boat, even though everybody wasn't healed, even though the work wasn't all done, because the work was truly never done. But he didn't wait until he was exhausted. He was very self-aware, and he listened to his own inner voice and the voice of the Father, because he was very in touch with that. And the Father, no doubt, inspired him to rest. So we need to all listen to that voice. So being aware of that voice, being aware of our own limits and needs is crucial in being able to stay healthy in ministry. And this self-awareness includes recognizing our own woundedness, our own need for healing, our own strengths, and our own weaknesses. And this can be done through reflective practice. And often it's done, as we heard earlier this afternoon, in conjunction with a spiritual mentor or a director or a supervisor or a counselor, someone who can help you to be objective, but also help you to recognize the danger signs. So a lot of Nouwen's writing was directed to clergy and people in ministry, and as Chris said, his 4 earliest books were really geared to people in ministry. He taught for years and years in the divinity schools of Yale and Harvard, but he also understood firsthand the struggles that clergy faced. So another little gem of the book, of a book that he wrote, is called The Living Reminder. And it's a book about the connection between ministry and spirituality, and how the minister must first of all be a person of prayer, who becomes a living reminder of Jesus Christ to others. So the first chapter in that little book talks about wounds and healing, but the second chapter talks about sustaining our ministry, the way that Jesus did. And he encourages ministers to develop an ever-growing intimacy with God in prayer, to make that the source of their entire ministry. And he says, it's important to look at our daily calendars and schedule in some time in the midst of our busy work, time with God, with the same realism that we would schedule our time with people. So authenticity then, I think, is born of this healthy self-awareness. Not being perfect, not being available 24/7 to everyone. We have to let go of feeling guilty that we're not available all the time. We have to set realistic expectations for ourselves and for others, the people we work with, for our families, for those in our parish. And we have to seek some kind of balance in serving others, in nourishing our own weary body and soul, and in scheduling time with God. So to me, making room for all of these three is a moral imperative. It's not a choice. And in his book, The Living Reminder, Nouwen says, the way we visit, preach, and celebrate, we must keep struggling with the question of how to be the way without being in the way. I love that. But I think the bottom line is that although we are wounded, we are still healers. There is hope. And with God's grace, we have the capacity to even use our own wounds to bring healing to others. And if we can work out of an understanding that the one who heals all wounds is among us, then we can offer this message of hope to others and to ourselves. Henri reminds us in The Wounded Healer that the Master is coming, not tomorrow, but today. Not next year, but this year. Not after all of our misery has passed, but in the middle of it. And not in another place, but right here where we're standing. So this is the message of hope that I think we can give with authenticity if we have examined our own lives and been open to share the lessons of our wounds and our healing with others. So Father Jim's going to expand on that now with a little bit more of the practical ways that we can do this, in particular when we're preaching.
Thank you. Wine and cheese. Does everybody have a watch? Is anybody here wearing a watch? Okay. Would somebody at 10 minutes, starting now, 10 minutes, put both hands in the air? If you put up one hand, I'll think you want to leave the room. Put both hands up and I'll know I'm done, okay? Because I could talk about this for a long time, and nobody wants me to do that. First of all, I know this question was asked at the last seminar here a couple of minutes ago, but how many of you preach regularly? Okay. The first thing I want to do is to thank you. To thank you for the work that you do. Because preaching is hard work. And we often don't get thanked for the work that we do. I mean, I know, standing at the back of the church, people coming out, and they go out and they say, "Great homily, Father, that was wonderful, really, really good." And I'm standing there thinking, I didn't preach. So you can't always take what people say to you on the way out as gospel truth. We don't get honest feedback most of the time about our preaching, and we almost never get people thanking us for the effort that we make in putting together a sermon. It's not easy. It's hard work. You got to put in time, you got to put in study, you got to put it in a lot of thought. And it's an art. Preaching and preparing a sermon is an art. And people who don't preach don't understand how exhausting it is. So I just want to say right off the top, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do in making that happen every week. Because it's a gift that you give to your people. That's the first thing I want to say. The other thing I would say in relation to Henri Nouwen is that he was a reasonably good cook, and a good host. I got to know Henry at daybreak because I would, for a number of years, I would go up and celebrate Mass for some of their houses and have dinner in one of them, get connected with the community up there. And then I got to know Henry, and I would go up and spend time with him and chat with him and have dinner with him a few times. And, so I got to know that he was a reasonably good cook. In the book, The Wounded Healer, Henry talks a lot about loneliness. And I think that's one of the things that we can all identify with, because as preachers, it's a lonely activity. Even if you have a committee that you meet with to prepare, you're still the one who has to put it together. You're still the one who has to deliver it. And there's a loneliness in that because it's all on you. And Henry talked a lot in the book, The Wounded Healer, about loneliness. And that's something that we all know, we share. So when you get up in the pulpit, you are a wounded healer. And that has nothing to do with all of the wounds that you bring with you into the pulpit because of the person that you are, the ways in which you have been broken over your lives, the guilt, the shame, the sense of disappointment, the frustration, the fear, the question about whether you are of any value. Are you doing any good? Does it make any difference that you do the work and you get up and deliver it every week? We carry that reality into the pulpit with us every week. And we get up and we do the best we can. We all have our own preaching style. And Peter, I don't want you to take any offense to this, but it doesn't matter how many preaching workshops you do, we've all got our own preaching style. And it doesn't matter how many workshops we go to, we're probably not going to change our preaching style a whole lot. We may tweak it a little bit here and there, get some ideas, but we've all got our own style. And we know stories about people whose style, is to moralize all the time, or to preach fire and brimstone all the time, or to talk down to their people all the time. I'm sure none of you do that. And the reason I know none of you do that is because the people who do that don't go to preaching workshops. We all have our own style, and we've all preached sermons that we would like to forget, and have prayed the people who heard them would also forget them. But most of the time we get up and we do the best we can. But in the book, The Wounded Healer, Henry talks about three main things. He talks about self-knowledge, and you've heard something about that already. He talks about listening, and he talks about knowing the environment, knowing who it is you're talking to. And all three of those things are critical when we go to preach. The self-knowledge we've heard a lot about. We need to know ourselves. You get up, somebody has just taken a strip off you before you get up there to preach, and you get up in the pulpit, and if you're not paying attention to how you might be feeling, your response to that person may come out in the sermon. Maybe not directly, but it may be there. We need to know how we're feeling. We need to know ourselves. I was a teaching supervisor in CPE, and I had most of the people who do CPE do it usually in one kind of a setting, often a general hospital. I had the good fortune of being able to do it in three different settings: Whitby Psychiatric Hospital, Kingston Penitentiary, and a big medical hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana. And the benefit for me was that it forced me in three different settings to have to confront 3 different realities in myself. I had to come to terms at the mental hospital with my own fear of losing control. Otherwise, I couldn't minister to those people. I went in thinking I was better than them. And from that perspective, you cannot empathize. You cannot meet their needs. I went into the prison thinking I was better than them. I had to discover that within me, those same feelings and attitudes and desires and thoughts were the same as what they had. Only I hadn't acted them out for all kinds of different reasons. And in the healthcare setting, I had to confront my own vulnerability, my fragility, and my finiteness in order to be able to sit at a bedside with somebody who might be dying and be able to stay there with them. I had to confront those realities in myself. And I always found it was kind of delightful actually. Teaching a unit of CPE, students would come in, now they could be theology students or could be people engaged in ministry, and they'd come in with a strong desire to learn skills for pastoral ministry. Fair enough. It always came as such a shock to them when they discovered that the skill they really needed to get in touch with was their own vulnerability. That they couldn't minister until they got in touch with that. And we can't preach effectively if we're not aware of our own need, our own frailty, our own need for the word that we're preaching. We also need to know our audience. When I first couple of times I went up to Daybreak and said Mass up there, and I'd give a homily. I think I'd only preached about 4 minutes. And one of the handicapped leaned over in their seat and started to go, "Time to move this along." Know your audience. And that's part of the benefit of being a pastor in a parish for a period of time. You get to know your people. But you have to listen to your people. You have to listen to what they're saying. And the problem is that we are so involved. So much of our time and energy in ministry gets taken up with administration and the running of the ship that we don't have time to listen. I remember when I was in the hospital doing CPE, I was ministering to a young man who had been in a motorcycle accident and lost a leg. And he was totally traumatized, terribly depressed. And I wasn't getting anywhere with him. And I went to my supervisor in my frustration, and I said, "Thank you." I said, "I'm getting nowhere. I'm totally frustrated." He said, "That's exactly how he feels." He said, "Now, how willing are you to stand in the pit with him until he's ready to move?" Because you can't move him. He has to decide to move himself. But he needs you to stand there with him to give him the anchor he needs to make that choice. And that's what we do when we preach. Every week we get up and we present the word to people, giving them an anchor to hold on to in the week ahead, to help them cope with whatever that week is going to bring them. That's what our preaching can do. And when we do that, then we have lived up to the wounded healer. Okay, time's up. I gotta quit. Sorry about that. The second half was even better.
We're gonna move you over. Yeah. Let's open up for first of all, Michelle, Jim, thank you very much. This is such an honor to be able to share this time. I was just going to say, yes, I'm the reason, or he's the reason I exist, yes. Which is a really nice part about conferences, because you get to meet people again in your life, and the role of a mentor, honestly, very important. Happy to talk more about that, but yeah, for both friends and co-presenters, thank you. We have a little bit of time before wine and cheese for questions or comments, and Lisa is roving with the white shirt there. She has a mic. Perhaps the easiest way, oh, you've got a question, perfect, just identify who you'd like to answer it, and off we go. So over to you, please.
Well, that was fast. I just want to say I'm Lily, but my
Lily, sorry.
chemistry teacher always called me Lisa, so I'm reminiscing now. One of the hardest things I had to do today, or was invited to do, was to raise both hands and interrupt Monsignor. It was so hard. I wanted to keep listening to you, but off we go with the questions.
Great. And I just practice good recovery and preaching when I get somebody's name wrong in the congregation. Yes.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth MacLeod from London. I'm just curious, and it's just to your last story that you were saying, Father, about you got frustrated, and it reminded me of the story in The Wounded Healer that Henri Nouwen starts with, about the young seminary student. But I'm surprised that we didn't hear from anybody about his whole concept of hospitality and the need to withdraw ourselves. Because I found that the most profound part of his book, of knowing who you are as a wounded healer, but also knowing that it's the withdrawing of yourself that you invite them in to become healed or to listen or whatever.
I think that's true. And when I had when I was putting this together and I was talking about self-awareness and this time we need to spend with God, I wanted to put the segue into that chapter on hospitality, and it just time got away from me. But I think that's so true. We need to be able to offer that hospitality to others. And we can only do that if we go away to reflect on it. So, Chris?
I was also going to add that I think one of the concepts, and you're nailing a really important part with Nouwen's work, is how one creates space. So when I was listening to both Michelle and Jim, what strikes me as part of their genius and was Nouwen's, he was very concerned, since we talked about trauma today, about how safety allows disclosure to happen. So Jim offered an experience of where he was getting in the way, to use that example, and he needed to provide safety for that person to act. So you're absolutely right. That theme shows up in Henri a lot. I might ask us to wonder, why was that so important to him, and what does that have to do with the gospel, is another really important message for today. Jim, did you want to comment on that, since you triggered this whole conversation?
Sorry. Thank you. It was a good question. One of the things I was going to say in response to that is that when we preach, one of the things that we do is to invite people to think. And inviting them to think engages them. It brings them into the scripture. It brings them into what it is you're preaching about. And that's an act of hospitality, really. It's a welcoming them, it's an encouraging them to become part of the story. Somebody made the observation that our story is not just our story, and the gospel story is not just Jesus' story. They're the same. We need to be able to take what we read in the scripture and say, how is this my story? How is this being lived out in my life? And then to bring that to the people that we're preaching to, so that they're invited into the experience of the gospel story. It's not always easy to do. And with some scripture passages, I find it impossible. Would have liked to have edited those parts out. But they didn't give me any chance. But sometimes it's easier to do that than others. But when we preach, we're always inviting people into the experience of the Word and inviting them to look at how does that Word live in their life each day.
Thanks for that question. Any other questions? Or comments? Yes. Here comes Lily.
Lovely vase. Did I see a hand here?
It's about the comment you just made about inviting them into the scripture. I'm not sure how it happens or when it happens, but I've always felt very privileged in my pastoral charges to have people invite me into their experiences, the good ones and the terrible ones. And I don't know if, they trust you because you preach every Sunday, or if because they invite you in, then you can preach to them, and that's how the trust develops.
I appreciate your comment, because as a pastor, one of the things that we are so privileged is that we are invited into people's personal lives, into their joys and into their sorrows. And that's a real time for listening, because what we hear, what they share with us, their experience can then shape how we hear the word and what we say when we get up to preach. They can be an incredible gift to us. And it's not just the individual conversations, but all of us, that are pastors, we need to look at how do we invite our congregations to share with us what they're experiencing, what their hopes and their fears are as a community. We need to be not just engaged in one-to-one, but we're all we're all pastors of a community. And so how do we engage the community? How do we listen to the whole community? So that can then also become part of what we then preach, what we include. We can speak to the community as well as just to individual life experiences.
I think the other thing about that is when we get back to what Henry said about being authentic. If we are ourselves and we're able to offer presence, and we've done our own work, we can make that a safe place. It can be a place of hospitality, and people feel comfortable. They learn to trust us. They learn to feel comfortable sharing with us. So, but it doesn't happen automatically. So it's a great chapter on the hospitality.
Sure. And just before we go to one other question, I think one of the things that's been great for us as a small panel is we've been thinking a little bit about what might help you the most, and we thought that Henry's early formation as a person who listened to those who suffered is really an important piece to remember as preachers. So we create space by being trustworthy. I work in healthcare, I have for many years. If trust is absent, it's that fiduciary basis for a healing encounter. You carry that as preachers, you carry that as pastors. So whatever you can do to create safe places is part of the gospel being lived today, I would argue. And if Henry were here today, I think you'd find him to be the kind of person you could run up to and say something, because he would listen first. Any other comments or questions? This is, as you can tell, we've enjoyed preparing for this almost as much as we've done just giving it. So, any other thoughts? I know we're the one thing between wine and cheese. Any final thoughts, team?
I was just going to say we've got Henri Nouwen's the website for the Henri Nouwen Society. We just redid the website, and if you want to visit it, you can sign up for free daily emails of a daily meditation that would come to your inbox, which is kind of a nice thing to come to your inbox instead of just spam. But there's a ton of phenomenal podcasts. Karen, the executive director, started the last few years, and I mean, there's Martin Sheen and Philip Yancey and Sister Helen Prejean, and like a lot of really, Anne Lamott, a lot of people, how Henry shaped their life and their ministry and their writings. And phenomenal podcasts. They're all at no charge. So visit their website. If you're doing research or you have seminary students that are wanting to do research, there's a link on there to get into some of the documents at the Henri Nouwen Archives and Research Collection, which sits at the University of Toronto, but you can have digital access to a fair amount of stuff. So just put a little plug in there for the society. Okay.
Just one comment before wine and cheese. I'm a retired pastor. I retired at the end of June, so I'm still practicing retirement. But I know for all of you who are pastors and running churches, it'll probably come as a terrible shock to you that I don't miss the administration or the responsibility. What I miss are the people. I miss being included in their lives. I miss the children, I miss the engagement, I miss the opportunity to share those good and bad moments with people, that intimacy. I haven't been retired long enough yet to find a replacement for that. I'm working on it. But those are really important experiences that will influence and shape how you preach. And so don't let the administration overwhelm your time listening to your people, because there's where the life is.
So with that, just thank you very much for hanging in there for an afternoon before wine and cheese. We're going to hang up here if there's any comments or questions people would like to ask us personally. And Peter? Yeah, and a reminder, there's what Michelle was talking about, there are pamphlets you can take from the Henri Nouwen Society, and if you'd like to get in touch with any of us, there's contact information there. So Peter, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, everybody.